We're back to the stories that we're reading about the destruction of Jerusalem and Israel. And much of what we're reading in this time happened during the time frame of Micah and Isaiah, during the prophecies that we read yesterday. And these are the final days of the kingdom of Judah. And because of their sin, God delivers them into the hands of both Syria and Israel. And this was the reign of King Ahaz. Remember, I mentioned him a couple of days ago. King Ahaz was a pretty bad king. He was the son of King Uzziah, who took over after his death, and he was the king that actually brought Israel to its lowest point. He violated God's law with the most evil and despicable and detestable acts, pagan acts, and that was child sacrifices to a god called Molech. Ahaz's reign was evil. He forsook the Lord, abandoned the temple, and worshipped idols. And as a result, God caused him to be defeated by Israel and Syria. But he didn't even learn from his lesson from this. And instead of repenting, he sought help from the king of Assyria in order to form a foreign alliance. Ahaz brought Judah to its lowest point. He not only allied himself with Assyria against Israel and Syria, but also gave the temple's treasure as tribute to the king, making Judah a vassal of Assyria. Most likely to demonstrate his allegiance to the Assyrians, Ahaz chose to practice Assyrian religion and worship their god called Ashur. He also used the altar of the Lord to practice divination, and he asked the priest at the time, Raja, to set it up. So imagine, this just went to buttress the point that, or the thing that Micah said during his time, during his prophecy, that the kings and the priests became wicked. Because imagine the priest helping the king set up the Lord's altar, the altar which was used for sacrifice to the Lord, for him to perform divinations. That's abomination as far as I'm concerned. The highlights, in Israel, so back in the city, the kingdom of Israel, their demise continued with King Hoshea. He was another bad king who became a vassal of Assyria and attempted to break away with the help of Egypt. But Egypt was weak and in no position to help them. And so when the king found out about that was when he now deposed or deported them, because he was like, oh, so this is what you're trying to do with Egypt. So we see the prophecies finally fulfilled in 17:5-19, where the Israelites are carried away in captivity to Assyria. The deportation of Israelites to Assyrian cities took place in the 9th year of King Hoshea's reign. This was after the king of Assyria had besieged Samaria for about 3 years. The prophecy was fulfilled due to Israel's continuous violation of God's law. That's intermarrying with the foreigners, alliances with pagans, improper worship of God, and the worship of idols. The Assyrian king's policy at the time was to destroy national ties by moving conquered people to another land, to like different lands. And so foreigners were resettled in Samaria, which had earlier been vacated. So he had taken them out and then brought foreigners to settle there. These foreigners became the ancestors of what the present day Samaritans are, So I believe that this was probably the genesis of there's some sort of hatred even in Jesus's day between Samaritans and Israelites. So maybe because they were foreigners and they still had their foreign practices and all of that, so there was that sort of contention. But even in the midst of all this, even though foreigners had come with their gods and they had settled in the land, God was still working it out to sanctify the promised land. And so he sent lions out against them. So they had lions coming and killing and mauling them. And when the king of Assyria heard that, because they had gone back to tell him that, listen, this land isn't safe because the people of the land don't know how to worship the God, he sent back a priest to go and teach the people who were residing, those the foreigners who were residing in Samaria at that time, the ways of the Lord. Now, the decision to send a priest back to Samaria to teach the people the ways of Yahweh was not entirely successful, probably because the priests themselves were corrupt. Because, I mean, if it was the same priest like Urijah and the rest of them, they were corrupt priests who had forgotten the laws of the Lord, and they have been serving idols to themselves. The result was a fusion of worship. There were people there, they were worshiping God, but also practicing paganism. It's something called synchronism, and I've spoken about it a couple of days ago, about that whole mixing and matching religion, when people worship God but then also have the pagan practices that are common to them or where they're coming from. This actually brought to mind a particular place, Brazil. My sister used to live in Brazil, and she told me how there was a part in the north, I think it's called El Salvador, where they practice the worship of orishas, which are like Yoruba deities. So definitely, it was like, slave. It was during the slave era when they were taken from Africa and resettled in these places. So they went with their god, but then they also worship God. But then she said it was like when you see it, it's like confusion. So they'll worship Jesus. There's Mary, but then there's also Ogun. There's Shango. There's Oya. There's all these gods. So they believe in that synchronism. And I wondered if it had something to do with maybe being in exile or being taken from your place of your origin and taken to somewhere else, and maybe perhaps to even just hold on to your identity, you hold on to your pagan gods. Now, that being said, let me share my hashtag getting to know God lesson. God is very, very, very patient. We've learned this over and over again, but it bears repeating. Following this long and depressing account of the Israelites finally going into captivity and getting the judgment the prophet warned them was coming over and over again. In 2 Kings 17:13-14, it says, "Yet the Lord testified against Israel and Judah by all of his prophets, every seer, saying, 'Turn from your evil ways.' But they would not listen. God sent them multiple prophets over the years, but they refused to take heed. While the captivity seemed like a tough end, it was just a tool God used to expose their true captivity. They were truly, really captive to sin and idolatry and disobedience. But thank God that he had a restoration plan in place to bring them back even after the captivity." Thank you for joining me today. Tomorrow we'll continue in the book of Isaiah, and I look forward to sharing my lessons with you. Have a good day. Bye.